There's a question about how you could add or modify the standards. There's talk about STEM and so forth. I just want to make clear that, first of all, that because of the copyright and the policy of the Federal Department of Education, you can add to, but you cannot modify what's there. And what you can add is up to 15%. So it's not a question of modifying what's there, including what is to be taught at each grade, but adding other things to it. I also want to mention that when there's talk about adding that won't count at the top end in math, that still doesn't address a question about whether the students are prepared to reach that. And I'm going to address some of those issues. So I previously addressed the cost, and I described the national cost, and I also mentioned that in Wisconsin, based on the data we've seen from your legislative bureau, you're likely to increase on an ongoing basis by at least doubling the ongoing annual cost of your grade 3 through 8 assessment, and that will be built in. That will money that cannot go to classrooms, that cannot help communities, but will be spent at the state level. In addition, we estimated, assuming your districts are typical in terms of technology, and we do encourage states to do in-depth feasibility analyses within their states, surveying their districts, but based on the typical district, there would be between 100 and 200 million in technology costs related to the online assessments. So I want to address now the benefits, because whatever the cost is, if the benefit is worth it, then I think we all agree that our children are worth it, and we should spend the money that it takes to give them the education they deserve. So it's a cost-benefit analysis. And so one of the claims that's often made for Common Core is that it's internationally benchmarked, at least in the general press. Originally, that was also the language from the development team that worked on Common Core, and then the final document switched to internationally informed. And I do want to mention that there's a world of difference between actually being benchmarked to the top scoring countries internationally and then being informed by what they do. And there's very good reason for that, and that's because in the end they were not benchmarked to the top scoring countries. If we could, this shows the performance of Wisconsin, as was mentioned, relative to other states. Wisconsin, you can see it on this is the grade 8 math, scored 289 on the NAEP scale, National Assessment. The U.S. average was 283 in 2011, and the top state, Massachusetts, was at 299. So you are somewhat above the average. So your goal is not to get to the typical average, the sort of median within the state. Your goal ought to be to exceed that and ideally reach towards international competitiveness, because we're economies in a globally competitive environment. And so if I could get the next slide. These are the results from the TIMSS, the International Math Science Study. These are the latest results released in December based on tests in 2011. And it's often reported that the U.S. is roughly in the middle of the pack. You know, that we're kind of the average in the international average. Well, that's true. But if you think about it from an economic standpoint, where do investors choose to invest? In terms of being a benefit to any investment, they don't really choose to invest in the average. They want to go where the maximum chance of success exists. And so you really want to look at the top scoring countries. And the top scoring countries tend to be from Asia. And those countries, that's the percent of their student body, their entire student body, that reaches the advanced level on the TIMSS. Now that's the level that provides a pool from which you could pursue a STEM career if you want. It's not necessarily they're all going to go into STEM, but those are the percentage that have a solid foundation by the end of 8th grade. And in the top scoring countries, it's nearly half. Taiwan, Singapore, Korea. Towards the bottom of that top tier, Japan is a little over a quarter. Now the U.S. is at 7%. And again, that's often reported as in the middle of the pack, because we are, if you just look at the rank order. But if you look at the percentage that actually are in that pool, we're actually a lot closer to the bottom of the pack. And the bottom of the pack are countries like Kazakhstan and Ghana, and we beat those. Okay, so we're in the middle of the pack. But the percentage of students is really a lot closer to those that are capable, have the skills, not because of their inherent capability, because of what they learn to reach for a STEM career. So we're really quite far from where we need to be internationally competitive with the top scoring country. Now, Wisconsin, there was a new study that came out recently. The Federal Department of Education is now linked the NAEP to the international comparisons, allowing you to get state-by-state results relative to top-scoring countries internationally. And so one of the things that's been one of the advantages been promoted for Common Core is this will give you an internationally competitive information of how your students are due. But in fact, this kind of information is not available for Common Core and won't be available, at least initially, but it is available with the exams you have now. And it could be made available with any new test, including any new test you adopt. So you don't need to adopt Common Core to get information, real valuable information, on how your state assessment performs, your students, relative to top-scoring countries. And you could actually provide that information to every parent and every community in the state without adopting Common Core. So Wisconsin's a little bit above the U.S., 7% in the U.S., 12% in Wisconsin. So you're still roughly in the middle of the pack, but you're not near the top, which is where that would take to be internationally competitive. If we could go to the next slide. Now, what about the other students, not the half in the top-scoring countries that reach internationally competitive standards, but the rest of the population? What about equity? If you look at the percentage of students that reach the intermediate level or higher, the top-scoring countries also are much better at getting students in the rest of their pool, of their population, to a higher standard. They get about 90% of their student to at least the intermediate level, and the U.S. gets 68% to the intermediate level at the very bottom. Wisconsin gets 77%. So consistent with the same idea, Wisconsin's a little bit better than the U.S., but not at the level of the internationally competitive, the top-scoring countries. So in terms of international competitiveness, that's where we stand. Now, if we could get the next slide. Now, what does it take to get into that top pool? The top-scoring countries teach the content of Algebra 1 often in 7th grade, in a few cases 8th grade. And so that's the level of skill that students achieve. That's the standard. Not everybody achieves that, but that is the standard, the general default expectation for students in the top-scoring countries. That's how they're able to get to that level of performance. Now, in Common Core, the regular track, the default track, as was mentioned earlier, has K-8 grade-by-grade standards and then leaves for high school starting potentially in 9th grade, Algebra 1 and later. So that's clearly at least 1 and possibly 2 years behind the internationally competitive track. Now, it's been mentioned that there's this alternative track that's a little more accelerated in the appendices in Common Core. And all that is saying, well, if you want to do Algebra 1 in 8th grade rather than 9th grade, you could. But in order to do that, they have to actually move some of the standards from 8th grade to 7th grade in sort of a kludge. And that's because the 7th grade standards do not prepare you in Common Core to do Algebra 1 in 8th grade. So they have to actually move a few of them, and then that packs a lot in to 7th grade. So these other countries, which I'm going to point out in a minute, they actually have a glide path from kindergarten. Somebody asked, at what grade should we start if we want to prepare students to have the skills for a STEM career? Well, they actually start from the beginning, and they have a gradual build-up of the skills that students need, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. Now, not all the students in high school are able to achieve that, but they have the glide path that allows them. They don't just pack a bunch of hard stuff into 7th grade and expect all of a sudden students will be ready for Algebra 1. So if we could get the next slide. Another claim for Common Core, one of the benefits proclaimed, is that it prepares students for college. Now, anyone can get in a room and talk and come up with something and say, well, this is college ready. But let's look at some data, if we get the next slide. There's a study by the U.S. Department of Education that confirmed an earlier study looking at, based on how far students get in the high school math curriculum, what is the probability, what is the actual chance that they complete a bachelor's degree? Algebra 2, students who only complete Algebra 2, which is all that's required under Common Core, have less than 40% of those students completed, and it's not until you get to pre-calculus, calculus, that you get majorities or large majorities. So in terms of actual data, what does it take? Who actually succeeds? It's pretty questionable. Next slide. Now, I want to address briefly the pedagogy. And people assume that these are standards for outcomes, right? I don't know how many times you've heard that, but this is about what students should be able to do at the end. It's not about how you get them there. It's not about the instruction. Well, that's wrong. Common Core is loaded with instructional assumptions. And in particular, it's shot through with some faulty progressivist instructional ideology. And I'm not talking about progressivism in the political sense, but there's an instructional progressivist philosophy that's been around for over 100 years, nothing new. A lot of the ideas are repackaged every few years, but there's core ideas instructionally in Common Core that are relate to that. I'd like to get the next slide. And this started, the movement, the recent movement Common Core, against Common Core, started with two moms in Indiana. And since not everybody can see that, I'm going to briefly read that. The story starts with two Indianapolis moms, Heather Cross and her friend Erin Tuttle. In September 2011, Heather suddenly noticed a sharp decline in the math homework her 8-year-old daughter was bringing home from Catholic school. Now, there they mandate that the state test to be administered in Catholic school, so they're already starting to implement Common Core. Instead of many arithmetic problems, the homework would contain only 3 or 4 questions, and 2 of those would be explain your answer. Heather told me, like, one bridge is 412 feet long, and the other bridge is 206 feet long. So you've been given the measurements. Which bridge is longer, and how do you know which of those 2 bridges is longer? You were told one is 412 and the other one's 206, and the question is, how do you know that one is longer? She found she could not help her daughter answer the latter question. The right answer involved heavy quotation from Common Core language. A program designed to encourage thought had ended up encouraging rote memorization, not of math, but of scripts of math. So there's a lot of talk in Common Core about encouraging students, so students are able to talk about math. But what about doing math? And so are these moms really just off base? Are they just amateurs that really don't know what they're talking about? I get the next slide. Well, a professor, School of Education, Andrew Porter, did an analysis of the Common Core standards. He looked at what is actually emphasized, and you can see there a sequence, cognitive demand it's called, and he classified the standards into memorize, like math facts, perform procedures. Now that actually involves solving equations, solving word problems. That's all perform procedures. Demonstrate understanding, and at the bottom you can see what those involve. Communicating about ideas, explaining findings, so it's talking about math. Conjecture, solve non-routine problems. Now what I meant when I said earlier about ideology, the instructional ideology that informs this, there's a sort of common assumption that the more abstract you get on that scale, the better. And people have asked, well, what does rigor mean? Well, as we've seen, rigor for Common Core is not about more advanced skills. It doesn't move students to be prepared for a STEM degree program or algebra in 7th or 8th grade, which would be more advanced. Instead, what it emphasizes these higher order thinking skills. And what it changes, you can see where it says perform procedures, 48% previously in most states, Common Core 43%. So it's a slight decline in actually doing math. Same with memorized math facts, it's a decline. Demonstrate understanding, in other words, talking about math, going from 28% to 35%. So it's a bigger emphasis on talking about math. Now, who's right? I mean, I can say this is right or that's wrong, and somebody else could say, no, that would be right and that would be wrong. If I get the next slide. So if Common Core actually benchmarked to international standards to what the top performing countries actually do, which Porter analyzed, they looked at the standards in the top scoring countries, they have 75% at 8th grade, the actually doing math. And in Common Core, it's 38%. That is a massive difference. And so it's not just about ideology or instructional perspective or flavor of the month. If you actually benchmark, what do the top scoring countries do? They emphasize doing math. So now what's wrong with being able to talk about math or explain what you're doing? Obviously there's nothing wrong with that, right? We want kids to be able to know what they're doing. But the proportions are wildly out of whack, at least if you have any confidence in what the top scoring countries do. So this is a real question. It's instructionally loaded. And I'll give you one other example. If you could skip to the next, go on to the next slide. So if you look at standard algorithms, there's a mention that Common Core is standard algorithms.
Mr. Rebarber, how many more did you have yet?
Just 5 minutes, if I could wrap up.
Okay, thank you.
So if you look at standard algorithms, it's been mentioned that it does require standard algorithms, and that's true. So it could have been worse. It could not require standard algorithms. But the glide path towards advanced skills in other countries has them doing, for example, the item there, fluently add and subtract multi-digit whole numbers using the standard algorithm. This is the column method, the standard algorithm. In top-scoring countries such as Korea and Singapore, they do it by grade 3. They do it in grade 3. In Common Core, it's slower. It's grade 4. Now, why? Why are they slower? And that's because they have these non-standard methods of adding and subtracting. You can see in grade 2 and in grade 3, fluently add and subtract within 1,000 using strategies and algorithms based on place value. These are all these non-standard strategies, right? Now, in principle, what's wrong with kids seeing a non-standard strategy to get the concept, understand what they're doing? The issue is that they teach it to fluency, and so they're supposed to practice it till they get to a very high accuracy, very high speed. That's what fluently means. They spend all this time developing fluency with methods that cannot be scaled up to high levels. That's an instructional assumption that other countries that achieve to high levels do not follow. And that follows, again, the progressivist ideology that's very hostile to standard algorithms and assumes it teaches kids to be, quote, robots, which is really just a smear against what actually works in top-performing countries. So if we could go on, I'll just move a little quickly, skip to the one more slide. So in closing, I want to just mention federalism. So people say this is state-led, and this is not federal control. The first quote there is a quote from Justice Louis Brandeis. The constitutional model, a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. That's the constitutional federalist model. Different states try different things, and if one doesn't work, they don't damage everybody else. But that's not what Common Core is. It's trying to create, if we could skip to the next slide, this is basically a federally enforced cartel trying to impose one model across states. States are working on this since 2009. I have to say there's been talk about national standards since 1991, not since 2007. I was actually involved in some of the congressional work that was done on that and the federal work. I worked at the Federal Department of Education. So there's been talk about this for a long time, but it started in 2009 in communication and in coordination with the Obama administration, which gave it a green light and said, we're going to try to enforce this with both carrots and sticks. And there hasn't been enough attention to the waivers. Under the waiver that Wisconsin signed, if you want to make any change, if you want to get away from Common Core, if you want to do anything different, your superintendent or whoever will have to ask permission from the Federal Department of Education. And it's been said there's been federal involvement. That has never been true before. That is a bright line that has never been crossed. Never before has the Federal Department of Education had to give permission to a state to make changes to its content standards, its academic standards, and so this is a fundamental break, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Representative Pope, thinking back, I think you had a question. Are you ready for that one now?
Indeed I am, if I can. There is my button. Thank you. Early on in your first presentation, I believe you mentioned, I need some lights here.
Is that possible? We can turn on the lights.
You talked about our Legislative Fiscal Bureau paper from August of 13, which I have with me, and said that essentially they determined that it would cost 2 to 3 times more for our assessment.
That's our determination based on information.
Okay, all right. 2 to 3 times more
it's
for
an estimate.
The estimate. Okay. Given that, if Wisconsin chose to do something else other than Common Core, be it Massachusetts, pizza, whatever,
sure.
Would that cost change? Would you anticipate, wouldn't you presume that we'd still need to be doing online testing? I mean, with technology being what it is and the future of being what it is, we wouldn't go back to paper and pencil.
Well, I'd say, first of all, just so you know, our organization, although we do a lot of policy research, actually the main programs that we run is an online testing platform. So we run online testing. We have a number of districts using it, like Miami and others, and so we are very familiar with online testing. So we have nothing against online testing, but I have to say it should not be taken as a given. So I would not agree that it should just be assumed I remember I spoke to another group, and they said, well, in the 21st century, shouldn't we be doing this? And I said, well, if you ask any business in this country that's making a decision on investing in technology, they would never say and would never make a decision on investing in technology based on what century they're in. Technology is based on solving a problem. It has to be a worthwhile investment. You have to see you're getting something out of it, usually either reduce costs or you get a benefit. So I guess I would say it should not be done simply because it's not forward-looking or whatever. It should be done if you think it's worthwhile and the benefits are worth the cost. And we tried to talk about costs and benefits. And so I guess I would say it depends on the benefits, because if you're looking at only testing alone, then you can get a lot of those benefits from paper and pencil. It's not clear yet what all the benefits are from online testing. There's been talk of innovative items and so forth, but those are really experimental. There's still a lot of questions about what they'll get out of that. A number of the items that they use and released in Common Core, not all of them, but some of them could be done in paper and pencil. There could be versions of those. So I guess I would not say as a given that it ought to be online. I think it's something that ought to be evaluated and judged. And so I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Well, are you suggesting that if Wisconsin were to go to some other form of standards,
Yeah.
and that then we would also develop some other form of testing?
Whatever
is that
standards you
additional
have,
cost?
whatever standards you have, you would need some way to test it. And so whether you'd have to develop a new test, for example, with all the development costs involved with that, would depend on whether you adopt standards that already have a test. So, for example, I know there's been talk about, well, could Wisconsin just adopt Massachusetts standards? Well, Massachusetts had tests, and Massachusetts actually released all of their test questions every year. Those were all public and released. But there are other options, too. So, for example, in Texas, which didn't adopt Common Core, the former commissioner there, Robert Scott, recently indicated why I wish other states would like to split the costs of developing the test items with us, and maybe there'd be some items we don't use, but there could be an item bank and we could really cut our costs. And so there are multiple options that you could pursue, either in collaboration with other states or in developing your own assessment or just adopting an off-the-shelf instrument, and the cost would be radically different depending on which of those you choose.
In your opinion, is it realistic that any of this could actually be done in the next 18 months?
If the test is already in existence, it could, but I don't think it's right to regard 18 months as a hard and fast deadline. I think that you ought to be willing to do what it takes to develop the best standards that are actually internationally competitive for your students. And if that requires 36 months, I would say it's your education system. You spend most of the money on it, and you ought to tell the feds, this is the time we'll need, and we're going to take this amount of time. And I would say that some people have questioned whether the feds would kind of allow that. And I just want to mention that Texas, which did not adopt Common Core, and unlike other states which didn't adopt Common Core, like Virginia, which claim that they still align their standards with Common Core, Texas did not claim they align their standards with Common Core. They spent 2 or 3 years, the last couple of years, in negotiations with the Federal Department of Education, and just a few weeks ago they got their waiver approved without Common Core and without saying they're fully aligned with Common Core. So I think it's more possible than people think to do whatever you think is right for your students.
Thank you.
Senator Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Rebarber. I appreciate your testimony.
Sure.
Do you have an estimate of a cost per student that should be involved in adopting Common Core and training the teachers, getting all the computers up to snuff, or you got a dollar figure?
We have the total dollar figures. I could send you per student. We didn't do it per student in the study, but I can give you the total dollar figures.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is if you look at the Legislative Fiscal Bureau paper for Wisconsin, it's quite a variation there. You know, they didn't do it exactly the same as you did. And this is the 4th of our hearings. In the first 2 hearings, we had a lot of school people coming in and saying, we're really happy with Common Core. It's made a big difference in having these grade level standards, and a lot of advantages to it. And I asked them, one after another, what does it cost you? because I was really curious, and I think it was unanimously that they said, you got to have a computer lab anyway. We got in-service costs all the time. We have textbook adoptions all the time. We're training and retraining our teachers, and we have curriculum specialists and all that. It's not the time and money costs in the school. It's a new focus, and so to me that really contradicts your kind of having this big figure about what it costs. And I'm not an expert on your research, but I just wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Sure. Well, partly it's I'd say a couple things. One, they have not yet implemented the online assessment, and so many people have not faced those costs yet. So that doesn't address part of what we included. And I will say that those costs are real enough that you've had states pulling away out of the National Testing Consortium mentioning that reason. And there have been a number of reports that districts, many districts, not all districts, but many districts are going to face very real costs in that area. The other areas I just want to mention, the costs are really pretty straightforward on the state testing. And I think those are very real, and you're building those in. In some of the other areas, we had 4 areas that we looked at: testing, technology, professional development, and textbooks.
Well, we've had big costs on state testing already.
Well, but this will increase your costs through grades 3 through 8 by at least double, maybe 3 times, ongoing basis every year based on the Legislative Bureau, and I've got the figures. I'm happy to go through those, but let me just address the rest of your question. You talked about professional development or textbook costs that they have anyway. Well, one of the things we noted in the methodology section of our study, and I know you haven't had a chance to see it, is that these are very real costs in the sense that even if they have to redirect funds that they were going to spend on something else, those funds are no longer available to do those other things. And so if they were doing good, if they were helping students in other ways, that's no longer possible. And so we're not trying to look at just net costs. We think in some cases there will be net cost increases. But we think the right way to look at Common Core costs is what are the total costs. And if they're justified, then they're justified. But if they're not justified, if they don't get you to internationally benchmarked levels, if they don't follow even internationally benchmarked procedures or methods, if they go in actually a different and opposite direction, then you're not able to do other things. And so that ought to be considered, not just in terms of legislative budgeting, but in terms of a policy decision. Is this the right track? And we think the citizens of each state need to make that track. I'm not telling that decision. I'm not telling you what you ought to make. But we've given our opinion of some of our concerns, and we think it'll actually be a diversion from real reform.
Okay, I've got 3 more questions. Representatives Brightmore, and then Schron, and Esselbein, and I'd like to move on to the next speaker. So, Representative Brightmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 questions. I think you stated several times that we can add but not modify Common Core standards.
Right.
We've heard testimony from district administrators that reiterate the local control aspect, that they have full control over their curriculum and standards and whatnot. And how does the federal government even know that we may have modified a standard and are using it currently? Are you suggesting that every school district has to report through DPI to the federal government what they do with their standards once they're adopted?
I'm describing what the policy is and what the law is, right? I'm not describing what somebody does contrary to that. So obviously somebody can not follow the policy, and your state could decide to ignore that fact, not follow the legally binding pledges and assurances that your DPI gave to the Federal Department of Education under the waiver that they would implement Common Core, not something else, and they would only be able to add 15%. These are under the applications for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and so the Federal Department of Education can impose consequences if you willfully violate your legally binding assurances and commitments. So I'm not getting into at this point whether they will. I think there's politics involved in that. There always are. I'm saying here are the commitments that are made, and here's what the law and the policy is. And if you don't enforce that, or if the federal government doesn't enforce that, I think that's another question.
I think I'll save that question if we have any more administrators that are going to testify. But can you comment at all on these adaptive tests that
Sure.
Common Core will be using?
Specifically the SBAC or just adaptive testing in general?
Well, just adaptive testing. I think that's relatively new to Wisconsin, and I think people might have some apprehensions about it and how it might be used.
I think the adaptive testing is relatively new on a large scale. The adaptive testing has been used in districts and in smaller scales. The idea is that based on the first few test questions that a student takes, then the next test questions are adjusted, made easier or harder, in order to focus the questions on the student's actual skill level. So you get a more accurate sense of where the student is if they're far off grade level, far below or far above. Usually the issue is whether they're far below. So in principle, it can give you a more accurate sense of students that are far below grade level, so you can look at growth. That's the positive side to it. A lot with spending less time than if you gave all those questions plus the on-grade questions. The questions about it relate more, that the legitimate questions about it in this case relate more, assuming they did that part well, which we don't know. The SBAC test itself, that is a brand new test. That has never been implemented anywhere before. They're just developing, they're finishing the field testing. It is a brand new test. And I guess I would say that based on the ideas of some of the individuals in SBAC of what constitutes good testing, there are legitimate questions about whether it will be a good test. The folks going into that, the primary intellectual backers of it, like Linda Darling-Hammond and others, have some very specific philosophies about assessment, about instruction, and so there are people who might disagree with that. And I think the question about whether it's a good test is we don't know, and nobody has any way of knowing until it's available.
So the adaptive test doesn't really give you a grade, just areas of perhaps the curriculum that the student is weak?
The adaptive test will still give you whether the student is at standards. It can still give you the grade. My point was, if in addition to the proficiency level, these tests often have a scale score. And so you could have the on a scale score far below where the cutoff is for grade level standards. Now, for a typical paper and pencil test, they'll give you 1 to 2 years. They'll capture performance 1 to 2 years off of that, above and below. Adaptive testing, in principle, can capture accurately the performance of students in high school who might be functioning 3, 4, 5 years below grade level, so you can measure the growth that they make in that high school. So you're dealing with a part of the population. It's designed to be efficient in giving an accurate score for students who are far below grade level primarily.
Thank you.
Sure.
Representative Schrock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a comment, first of all, to begin regarding Representative Pope's comment about the fact that she was here in 2009 and knew all about Common Core, and I was wondering, why we're having these hearings. I would contend that based on the last few hearings that we've had and the number of people, the number of emails that we're getting as legislators, that DPI did a horrible job, I think a horrendous job, rolling out a Common Core. My question to you, and I thank you for validating my concern about federalism. I come from the private sector. I own a restaurant, and when we come up with a new product, if I'm going to add a sandwich or whatever, we field test it. We pilot test it, if you want to say that, to see if it's something that we want to put on the menu. Instead of just making a decision, putting it on, and having it bomb. I think as legislators, all of us sitting here are in a very precarious situation, because I go to my CISA 6 meeting and I sit in front of all the administrators, and I know that there's probably a lot of administrators here today, and I understand their concerns, that they've rolled this out 3 years ago, and now they've got all these costs involved. And if we stop now, it's going to put everybody behind. I also serve on the Rural Schools Task Force, and we had a hearing last week, and we're learning that there's a lot of funding problems. They've got broadband issues. I know I've thrown out about 5 different things to you, but just wondering, if you want to speak to any of my comments. I think the key, and why we're all here, is the way that this was rolled out. And if it was rolled out with a pilot program throughout the state, we may not have as many people upset that this just was kind of brought on to us.
Maybe I'll address 2 of the issues. The question about a pilot, I think, is legitimate. We're taking this grand experiment because these are not only standards that have never been implemented before, they're standards that in some key ways are at odds with the international top performers and the way they develop math skills. They use some unusual methods. I was going to be talking, I'm hoping he addresses the geometry, and the way they teach geometry, which is a way that's never been taught before except in one case, and at a large scale, and it didn't work, and they dropped it. So we're talking about something that hasn't been piloted and is being imposed now. It's totally opposite the laboratories of democracy, which don't affect everybody else in the country if one state screws up, the constitutional law. And if it had been piloted, I guess I would say maybe we wouldn't be implementing it. And then in closing, I just want to say about the people who've already gone pretty far down the road. I think we should have a new discussion about school reform in this country. The reason we're at Common Core, the reason we've ended up with national standards, is because this model has been pushed, whereas previously we used to have local control. There's been this model pushed of state standards-driven reform, test-driven reform. That is how you get reform. Now, I believe in testing. I think testing needs to happen at every grade. Parents need to get information. But standards and testing as a blueprint for reform is a relatively new concept in the last 20 years. And we've seen in the last 15 years that it has not worked at the state level. The level of improvement that the standards, the advocates of that model, test-driven reform, pushed for it and claimed for it, didn't happen. So now what they're left with is, what do we do next? Well, the response, in effect, is, well, if it didn't work at one level, let's do it at bigger and bolder and impose it on everybody at the national level, because that's all they have left. That's the only reason we're in this discussion. If the state model had worked, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And so instead of questioning the underlying assumption of test-driven reform, they're just doing it bigger and trying to impose one monolithic approach on everybody else. And I guess I would just plant a seed for that bigger discussion, because I'm sure your chairman wouldn't want me to go on about the whole issue, but I'll just plant a seed, which is, I think we need to get to a point where, and I've managed a system of schools that achieve high results with disadvantaged students in charter schools and other environments. I hope we get to a point where we can allow schools and districts and charter schools and private schools especially, they want to take a particular curricular approach and curricular emphasis to use respected, reputable tests that are aligned with that emphasis and allow them to go in that direction, and the state can monitor it and would not impose one model on every school in the state. And you can have accountability, and I'm someone from the testing background, so I'm telling you, could have accountability without imposing a single test-driven model on every private school that takes vouchers, at least on the students that are voucher paid, every charter school, every public school, every system in the state. And so I think we need a broader discussion that moves back towards teachers and parents being in charge of what curriculum and what instruction makes sense. And then those districts that wanted to do this would be allowed to do it. They wouldn't have to undo what they did. But those that want internationally competitive standards, that want something better, in my view, better, would be able to do that. And we would have testing as a monitor after the fact, rather than testing and standards as the blueprint everybody's trying to march in lockstep behind.
Representative Hesselbein.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. I want to please go back. Where do you live?
I actually live in Virginia. Our headquarters is in Bethesda, Maryland.
Wonderful. Please tell people in Maryland that it's a great website, so thank you. I was just peeking at it before. And AccountabilityWorks.org, correct?
And we also have one for online testing, but that's the policy one.
Wonderful. So when you were first talking, I thought this was just a financial analysis. But then I was reading through and I saw that one of the things you say is the most effective type of accountability is that which is self-imposed. Mm-hmm. AccountabilityWorks provides assessments and other tools that allow educators, parents, and students to monitor progress. So what do you do? Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you assist states in designing accountability assessments and developing new assessments and looking at the cost? Do you go from where you live, Virginia, to different states and come up with 100 different models and state assessment tools? And then if you do, are you here marketing AccountabilityWorks?
We do not have any product that I'm marketing. The only products that we have are certain online tests that are used by some districts, which, as you may note, I have not mentioned. I didn't even mention that. Right. Well, at one point. But my point is I haven't mentioned any specific products. We're not promoting any products. I'm not trying to sell any products. We're a nonprofit. Even if we sold more products, I wouldn't benefit from it. Our mission as a nonprofit is to support states, districts, and parents that want to put in high-quality systems, also in using evidence-based approaches. And we've done policy analyses of differential compensation and performance-based compensation. We've looked at a variety of things, but we are not pushing any particular model for. The only state assessment that we have helped develop is an English language assessment that we have not tried to promote in any other state that's being used in one state. And we've made zero effort to promote it in any other state.
15% deviation from the standard, as if there's going to be Common Core police roaming through the halls of the schools going, stop, you have exceeded your 15%, you can't teach this child anymore.
Right.
I just don't see that as happening, and I find it a bit ludicrous. So there was a question.
Well, there were two questions, I think, actually. So I'll try to address.
There was a question and comment.
Okay, well, I'm going to address your comment, too.
Okay.
The question was about funding, the first question, and that was, and who invited us, or did we invite ourselves? We don't invite ourselves. We were invited by some of your local citizens here, a local group of citizens who, as far as I know, have no commercial interest in here, are paying my travel costs, but our organization is donating my time. I'm not receiving any money for being here, and it's taking away time from the other things that we do, but I'm happy to do it. So they're paying just for travel costs. The second point, or at least the comment, which I think is important to address about standards police or something like that, the reality is that districts do pay attention to standards when they adopt textbooks, and the tests in this day and age make a big difference. And so if something is not on the state test, that's going to be viewed one way. And if something is on the state test and the way it's measured is on the state test, so the way communicating about math is measured, or just the skills that are on there are measured, districts pay a lot of attention to the test. In fact, there's been a lot of concern, I would say nationally, but I would assume it's been here too, that maybe there's too much attention to tests. And so the testing is the teeth, in effect, to enforce the standards. You don't need inspectors going around policing classrooms. The tests do a pretty good job, not perfect, but they enforce the standards to a significant degree.
So my follow-up to the co-chairs then, one of which just left. So did you invite this gentleman based on input from citizens from nameless groups?
There are individuals that bring us ideas for people to contact. We, at least myself, investigate whether or not these would be good speakers, and I answer yes or no if we're willing to give extended minutes, no different than I did for Dr. McCallum before.
But the two co-chairs invited this gentleman to be here today?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good. All right, I guess that's it. Thank you.